In the back garden of an imposing mansion under an orange sky, a man in a grey suit digs a deep hole. His 6-year-old stepdaughter plays absent-mindedly with flowers, unaware of the danger. With a calculated movement, he calls her. When she approaches innocently, he grabs her and places her inside the hole. "Please get me out of here," cries the girl, her small hands extended in desperation. The man, with eyes empty of emotion, begins to throw dirt over her as she cries in panic. What he doesn't notice is that his own white horse is watching everything from behind the trees. The animal, which has always had a special connection with the girl, seems to understand the gravity of the situation. What happens next defies all. Understanding and reveals a family secret so dark that no one could imagine. Before we continue, if you, like us, love animals, please subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any exciting stories. Thank you. Let's get back to our story. The sun dipped lazily toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink that spilled across the immense gardens of Ashworth Manor. Isabel, a 6-year-old girl with curious eyes and dark braids, played among the wildflowers that grew freely at the back of the property. Her small hands gathered daisies as she hummed a made-up tune, oblivious to the shadows beginning to stretch across the manicured lawn. Near the stables, Starlight, a majestic white mare, watched the unfolding scene intently. The horse had a special bond with Isabel, who always brought fresh apples and spent hours whispering her childhood secrets to the noble animal. That particular afternoon, something in the air felt different, and Starlight kept her attentive eyes fixed on the figure of Edward Ashworth, who walked through the garden with determined steps. Edward, Isabel's mother's new husband, was a successful businessman who had entered their lives just 6 months ago. Dressed in his usual impeccable grey suit, he seemed out of place among the wildflowers and ancient trees. His eyes, normally cold and calculating during business meetings, now held a strange expression as he watched his stepdaughter play. "Isabel," he called, his voice controlled but tense. "Come here. I need to show you something interesting I found in the garden." The girl hesitated for a moment, her hands still clutching the freshly picked daisies. There was something in her stepfather's voice that made her want to stay right where she was, protected by the familiarity of her flowers. In recent days, she had noticed subtle changes in his behavior, especially after she started asking questions about the old photographs she found in the attic. "What is it, Uncle Edward?" she asked, deliberately using the term that annoyed him. Ever since noticing the differences between him and the man in the old photographs, Isabel refused to call him Dad. Edward approached, his shadow looming over the small girl. "I found something that belonged to your real father," he said, his voice now softer, almost hypnotic. "Come see!" The words had the desired effect. Isabel stood up, her natural curiosity momentarily overcoming her hesitation. She still held her daisies firmly as she walked towards her stepfather, letting small petals fall along the path like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Starlight, sensing the growing tension, began to move restlessly in her paddock. The horse pawed the ground, creating an anxious rhythm that echoed through the darkening garden. Her intelligent eyes never left the scene for a second. Isabel followed Edward to a more secluded area of the garden, where ancient trees cast deep shadows even during the day. There, partially hidden by a large oak, was something that made the girl stop abruptly. A hole had been dug, deep and dark, its edges clearly defined against the dark earth. "What's inside?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly as she took a step back. Edward smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "The truth, my dear. The truth you were so eager to discover." At that moment, Starlight neighed loudly, a sharp, urgent sound that cut through the twilight air like a warning. The noise startled Isabel, who dropped her flowers as she quickly turned towards the stables. It was this moment of distraction that Edward chose to act. Isabel's instincts screamed for her to run, but her feet seemed glued to the ground. Edward moved with the precision of a predator, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her tremble. However, before he could reach her, the sound of thundering hooves broke the tense silence of the garden. Starlight, in an extraordinary act of strength and determination, had jumped the paddock fence. The majestic animal galloped towards them, her white mane flowing like a banner in the wind. Edward recoiled instinctively, surprised by the sudden intervention. "Starlight!" Isabel cried, her voice a mixture of relief and fear. The mare positioned herself between her and her stepfather, her ears pinned back in a clear show of warning. Just then, another figure emerged from the garden shadows. Henry, the groundskeeper who had tended the property for over 30 years, had been drawn by Starlight's unusual neigh. His experienced eyes quickly assessed the scene: the frightened girl, the suspicious hole, the stepfather with an uncontrolled expression. "Everything all right here, Mr. Ashworth?" Henry asked, his calm voice masking the concern he felt. He had known Starlight since she was a foal and had never seen her act this way. Edward quickly adjusted his posture, slipping back into his mask of civility. "Of course, Henry. Just showing Isabel where we're going to plant the new tree she wanted so badly." His smile didn't reach his eyes, although it seems Starlight decided to join our little gardening adventure. Isabel, shielded by the mayor's presence, found the courage to speak. "But I didn't ask for any tree," she said, her voice small but firm. "You were talking about making it a surprise," Edward interrupted sharply. "And now you've spoiled it, haven't you?" His tone was lightly threatening, disguised as teasing. Henry casually stepped closer, years of experience telling him something was very wrong. "Miss Isabel, your mother was looking for you in the main house. Why don't you head up there? I can help Mr. Ashworth with the tree project myself." The girl hesitated, looking between Henry and Edward. Starlight took a step forward, gently nudging Isabel with her muzzle toward the house. The horse seemed to understand perfectly the need to get the child away from there. "Go on, dear," Edward said, his voice now controlled. "We'll continue our chat another time." Isabel started to walk away, but stopped to retrieve her fallen daisies. As she bent down, her eyes caught something shiny at the bottom of the hole. A familiar pocket watch, identical to the one in the old photographs with her real father. "Leave the flowers," Edward ordered. "It's getting dark and your mother must be worried." The girl obeyed, but her heart was pounding. That watch shouldn't be there. It was the same one she'd seen in the attic photos, in the hands of a man who looked like Edward, but who smiled genuinely, who had kindness in his eyes. As she walked towards the house, Isabel could feel the weight of the stairs behind her. Starlight remained standing, like a white sentinel in the twilight, until the girl was a safe distance away. "Will you be needing help filling that hole in, sir?" Henry asked, his voice deliberately casual. "That won't be necessary," Edward replied curtly. "I have other plans for it." Henry nodded slowly, his eyes meeting Starlight's in silent communication. In all his years on the property, he had learned to trust the animal's instincts, especially Starlight's, and tonight, everything about her screamed danger. "As you wish, sir. I'll be nearby if you change your mind." Henry started to walk away, but paused for a moment. "You know, Mr. Ashworth, it's funny how children notice things we adults sometimes miss. Miss Isabel, for instance, she has a special knack for noticing details." Edward stiffened visibly. "What exactly do you mean by that, Henry?" "Nothing in particular, sir. Just an observation." The groundskeeper touched the brim of his hat in a respectful gesture, but his eyes remained alert. "Have a good evening." That night, Isabel couldn't sleep. Her room on the second floor of the manor, usually a safe haven decorated with teddy bears and pink curtains, felt different under the silvery moonlight. Every shadow held a secret. Every noise made her heart race. Sitting on her bed, hugging her favorite teddy bear, a gift from her previous father, the one from the photographs. The girl tried to gather her thoughts. Why were there two identical watches? Why did the man in the old photos look the same yet so different from Uncle Edward? And why did he get so angry when she asked questions about the past? A soft neigh caught her attention. Approaching the window, Isabel saw Starlight grazing under the moonlight, far beyond her usual paddock. The mare seemed to be standing guard, her eyes occasionally glancing towards the girl's bedroom window. "You know something's wrong too, don't you?" Isabel whispered into the night. "Talking to yourself, dear?" Her mother Helen's voice made Isabel jump. Helen stood in the doorway, wearing her blue silk robe, her long dark hair, so much like her daughter's, loose on her shoulders. "Mommy, why does Uncle Edward have the same watch that Daddy Charles used in the old photos?" Helen froze for a moment, her expression subtly changing. "What are you talking about, Isabel? I saw it in the hole in the garden. It was just like the one in the pictures I found in the attic, the ones from the wedding, when Daddy Charles laughed holding the watch Grandpa gave him." "Isabel, we've talked about this," Helen said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Edward is Charles's twin brother. It's natural they might share some things." "But why didn't he ever tell me the story about the teddy bear? He said he gave it to me, but in the photos, it's Daddy Charles giving it to me on my 3rd birthday. Helen ran a hand through her hair, a nervous gesture Isabel knew well. "Honey, sometimes our memory plays tricks on us. You were very young. And why doesn't Uncle Edward know how to make oatmeal the right way? Daddy Charles always put cinnamon in it and told the story of the 3 bears while he stirred the pot. Uncle Edward doesn't even know the story." "Enough, Isabel!" Helen's voice was sharper than intended. Softening her tone, she continued, "It's late, you need to sleep. And stop calling Edward Uncle. He's your father now." "No, he's not," Isabel muttered, but her mother was already standing up, clearly disturbed. "Tomorrow we'll talk about you snooping around in the attic. Now sleep." Helen walked to the door, hesitated for a moment as if wanting to say more, but just shook her head and left. Isabel returned to the window. Down below, Starlight still kept her silent vigil. The girl watched as Henry, carrying a flashlight, approached the mare. Even at that distance, she could see the groundskeeper examining something on the ground. Could it be the daisies she had dropped? A movement in the window of Edward's study caught her eye. Her stepfather was on the phone, gesturing agitatedly. Even without hearing, Isabel could sense the tension in his posture. Suddenly, he turned and looked directly at her window. The girl quickly hid behind the curtain, her heart beating like a small drum. When she gathered the courage to peek again, she saw Edward hurrying out of the study. Moments later, his figure appeared in the garden, heading towards the spot where Henry was still investigating. The groundskeeper quickly pocketed something. Could it be the watch? "What are you doing out here so late, Henry?" Edward's voice floated up to Isabel's window. "Starlight was restless, sir. Came to check if everything was all right." "And? You needed a flashlight for that? Dark night like this. Better safe than sorry, wouldn't you say?" Isabel watched the tense exchange between the two men, feeling that something important was happening, something she didn't fully understand. But one thing was certain, she wasn't alone in her suspicions. Starlight knew, Henry knew, and maybe her mother knew too, even if she didn't want to admit it. The girl hugged her teddy bear tighter. "We'll find out the truth," she whispered to him. "Won't we, Sebastian?" The teddy bear, with his button eyes and embroidered smile, seemed to agree silently. The next morning brought a series of changes to Ashworth Manor. Isabel woke to the sound of raised voices from downstairs. Approaching the staircase silently, she could make out her mother's voice, thick with tears. "What do you mean, boarding school? She's only 6 years old, Edward." "It's for the best, Helen. The school in Switzerland has an excellent reputation. Isabel needs discipline, structure, but just like that, without even consulting me. It's already decided. Her bags will be packed today. The flight leaves tomorrow morning." Isabel felt her world spin. Switzerland, boarding school. Her small heart pounded unevenly as she crept back upstairs, trying not to make a sound. She needed to think, needed a plan. In her room, she hugged Sebastian tightly. "They want to separate us," she whispered to the bear. "But I won't let them." A movement in the garden caught her attention. Henry was crossing the lawn carrying a basket of apples, Starlight's favorite treat. Isabel watched as the groundskeeper, after feeding the mare, discreetly dropped something on the ground. A small folded piece of paper. Minutes later, when Edward left for his morning meeting at the company and Helen shut herself in her room, Isabel snuck down to the garden. She found the note exactly where Henry had left it, partially hidden under a dry leaf. "Meet me at the stables after lunch. Bring Sebastian." The note was short, but it filled Isabel with hope. Henry must have discovered something important. The hours dragged on. During lunch, Isabel barely touched her food, watching her mother and Edward. Helen was pale, her eyes red from crying. Edward, on the other hand, seemed strangely satisfied, constantly checking his phone. "Eat your vegetables, Isabel," he said with false sweetness. "You'll need to be strong for your big adventure." "What adventure?" she asked, feigning innocence. "Oh, it's a wonderful surprise. Your mother and I will talk to you about it later." Isabel noticed how he avoided looking directly at Helen, how his right hand drummed nervously on the table, a gesture she'd never seen in the old photographs of the real Charles. Finally, after lunch, Edward retreated to his study and Helen went to lie down, complaining of a headache. Isabel seized the opportunity to slip out to the stables, Sebastian held firmly against her chest. Henry waited for her inside one of the empty stalls, distractedly stroking Starlight's muzzle. His usually calm face was etched with worry. "Miss Isabel," he said in a low voice, "I need you to tell me everything you know about your stepfather. Every detail, every difference you've noticed." The girl took a deep breath and began to speak. She told him how Edward didn't know the stories Charles used to tell, how he held his coffee cup with his left hand when Charles in the photos was right-handed, how he didn't recognize the music Charles always played on the piano to help her sleep. Henry listened intently, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. "And the watch? Can you tell me more about it?" "It was Grandpa's," Isabel explained. "He gave it to Daddy Charles on his wedding day with Mommy. It has an inscription inside. 'To my son Charles, may time always be your friend.'" The groundskeeper took something from his pocket. It was the watch he had found in the garden the night before. "Like this one!" Isabel took the object with trembling hands. She carefully opened it, and her face lit up. "It's the same one! But why was it buried in the garden?" "I think," Henry said slowly, "that your real father wants us to find something, and this watch is the first clue." At that moment, Starlight neighed softly, her ears twitching towards the stable entrance. Seconds later, they heard approaching footsteps. "Quick!" whispered Henry, helping Isabel hide under a pile of clean hay. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Isabel hugged Sebastian tightly, her heart beating so loudly she feared it could be heard. Through a small gap in the hay, she saw Edward's polished boots entering the stables. Edward entered the stables with deliberate steps, his Italian loafers incongruous on the dirt floor. Starlight immediately positioned herself in front of the stall where Isabel was hidden, as if knowing exactly what to do. "Ah, Henry." "Edward," said his voice artificially cordial. "Figured I'd find you here, always so dedicated to your duties." "Yes, sir." Starlight was a bit restless today. Henry continued brushing the mare's coat, his movements calculatedly slow and precise. "Interesting how this animal seems especially protective of my stepdaughter." Edward walked closer, studying the stables with keen eyes. "Speaking of which, you haven't seen Isabel around, have you?" "No, sir, not since last night in the garden." The mention of the previous night made Edward visibly stiffen. Yes, the garden. Funny how you showed up right at that moment, wasn't it? Under the hay. Isabel held her breath. Sebastian was clutched against her chest, and she could feel the watch in her pocket, heavy with its secrets. You know me, sir, Henry replied calmly. 30 years looking after this property. The animals are my responsibility. 30 years is a long time, Henry. Edward began pacing through the stables, examining every corner. Long enough to learn many secrets of the Ashworth family, I imagine. I just do my job, sir. Yes, yes, your job. Edward stopped near the stall where Isabel was hidden. You know, I've been thinking. With Isabel going off to boarding school, perhaps it's time to modernize the property, replace some outdated elements. The veiled threat hung in the air like smoke. Henry stopped brushing Starlight, finally facing Edward directly. Mr. Charles, the real Mr. Charles, always said tradition has its value. Edward's face contorted for an instant, the mask slipping momentarily. Charles isn't here anymore, is he? And as for what he said or did, well, that's in the past. At that moment, starlight began to pour the ground, creating a providential distraction. Edward stepped back, his expression revealing a flicker of fear of the imposing animal. Control that mare, Henry. She has a strong personality, sir. Like I said, some elements are too traditional to be simply replaced. Edward narrowed his eyes, catching the subtext. Be careful, Henry. Excessive loyalty can be dangerous, just like poorly buried secrets, wouldn't you say, sir? The air in the stables grew electrically charged. Isabel, in her hiding place, barely dared to breathe. Through the gap in the hay, she could see Edward's hands clenching into fists. You're fired, he said finally, his voice sharp as ice. I want you off the property by nightfall. As you wish, sir. Henry remained calm, though his eyes betrayed concern. May I at least finish tending to Starlight? Pack your bags, Henry. Now. Edward turned to leave, but stopped at the door. And if you happen to run into Isabel, tell her I'm looking for her. We have an important conversation pending. As soon as Edward left, Isabel emerged from the hay, silent tears streaming down her face. Henry, you can't leave. Please. The groundskeeper knelt beside her, his expression kind but determined. Sometimes, Miss Isabel, you have to take one step back to take 2 steps forward. He pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket. Keep this with the watch. And trust Starlight, she knows more than she lets on. Isabel took the folded paper, her small hands trembling. But what if Uncle Edward? Don't be afraid of him. You're stronger and smarter than he realizes. Henry smiled, though his eyes were sad. Now go before he comes back, and remember, not everything is as it seems. The girl hugged the groundskeeper tightly before running back to the house, Sebastian and the watch safe with her. The paper in her pocket seemed to burn with its yet unrevealed secret. Alone in her room, Isabel finally found the courage to open the paper Henry had given her. The message, written in neat handwriting, made her heart leap. The real Charles is alive. The watch holds more than time. Look where the hands meet at midnight. Trust only Starlight. The girl looked at the old watch in her hands, studying it with new attention. The hands were stopped, pointing exactly at 12. Turning the object over, she noticed something she hadn't before. Tiny scratches on the back cover, forming a peculiar pattern. A sound in the hallway made her quickly hide the watch and the note inside Sebastian through a small tear in the lining she had discovered long ago, her secret hiding place for special treasures. The door opened and Helen entered, carrying an empty suitcase. Her eyes were red and swollen. Let's pack your things, honey, she said, trying to smile. The boarding school has a very nice uniform, you'll see. Mommy, Isabel approached cautiously. Why did Daddy Charles never call us again? Helen froze mid-motion of opening the suitcase. He had an accident, you know that. But we never went to the hospital to see him. There was never a funeral. Why? Isabel, please. Helen sat on the bed, her hands trembling slightly. Some things are too complicated to explain. Like Uncle Edward showing up right after? Like him being the same but different from Daddy Charles? Enough! Helen stood up abruptly. Edward is your father now, and he only wants what's best for you. Boarding school will be a wonderful opportunity. Isabel watched her mother move around the room, mechanically sorting clothes and toys. There was something in her movements reminiscent of a bird trapped in a cage. Beautiful, but without freedom. Mommy, she tried again, her voice soft. Are you happy with Uncle Edward? Helen stopped, a small blouse of Isabel's in her hands. For a moment it looked like she might break down, but then her posture stiffened. I'll ask Maria to bring some boxes for your books. As soon as her mother left, Isabel ran to the window. In the garden, Henry was loading his few belongings into an old pickup truck. Starlight, still loose in the pasture, watched the scene with apparent sadness. Suddenly the mare lifted her head and looked directly at Isabel's window. Her intelligent eyes seemed to convey an urgent message. The girl followed the animal's gaze and noticed something surprising. Near the stables, partially hidden by bushes, stood an old sundial. The hands meet at midnight, Isabel murmured, remembering the note. Her gaze flickered between the sundial and Starlight, who was now pawing the ground rhythmically, as if pointing towards something. An idea began to form in her mind. Charles's watch, the sundial, Henry's message, it was all connected. But before she could explore this thought further, she heard raised voices from downstairs. You can't just fire Henry. It was her mother's voice. He's been with us for decades. I can and I have, Edward replied curtly. And I suggest you watch your tone, Helen. We don't want Isabel overhearing arguments, do we? Especially on her last day home. Last day? Helen's voice rose an octave. You said it would be tomorrow. Change of plans. The private jet is ready to leave tonight. Isabel felt her blood run cold. Tonight? She looked again at the garden, where Henry was finishing loading his truck. The groundskeeper paused for a moment, took something from his pocket, it looked like a cell phone, and made a quick call, his eyes never leaving the manor. The girl hugged Sebastian tightly, feeling the watch hidden inside him. She knew she had to act quickly, but how? What did the sundial have to do with all this? And why did Starlight keep pointing insistently in that direction? A plan began to form in her mind, bold, scary, but necessary. If Edward planned to send her away tonight, she needed to uncover the truth before then, and somehow she felt Starlight would be key to her success. Twilight was beginning to paint the sky when Isabel finally found her chance. Edward was shut in his study, making mysterious phone calls, and Helen had retreated to her room with one of her frequent headaches. The house was quiet except for the distant sounds of Maria, the housekeeper, tidying the kitchen. Isabel waited until she heard Maria's footsteps fade away before slipping out the back door. Sebastian, with the watch still hidden inside, was held firmly against her chest. The night air was cool, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of garden flowers. Starlight waited for her beyond the bushes, as if she knew exactly when the girl would come. The animal approached silently, her hooves stepping with surprising delicacy on the soft grass. "You're going to help me, aren't you?" Isabel whispered, stroking the mare's velvety muzzle. In response, Starlight lowered herself slightly, a clear invitation for the girl to mount. With her heart pounding, Isabel managed to scramble onto the animal's back, clinging to her silky mane. Starlight moved with extraordinary care towards the sundial, stopping precisely beside it. The stone monument was covered in vines, but something in its design caught Isabel's attention. The number markings looked different from those she'd seen on other sundials. There were strange symbols carved between them. "The hands meet at midnight," she murmured, recalling the message. But how could a sundial mark midnight? It was impossible unless... Isabel pulled the watch from inside Sebastian and examined it again. The scratches on the back cover. They weren't random scratches, they were a pattern. Holding the watch close to the carvings on the stone monument, her heart leaped. They matched perfectly. At that moment, a soft, metallic click sounded. A small, secret drawer slid open at the base of the sundial, revealing its contents. A yellowed envelope and an old key. Isabel's hands trembled as she took the objects. The envelope had a single word written on it. Helen. The handwriting was identical to that in the old love letters she'd found in the attic, her real father's handwriting. A soft neigh from Starlight alerted her. Voices from the house indicated her absence had been noticed. "Isabel!" Edward's voice sounded furious. "Where are you?" With quick movements, Isabel tucked the envelope and key along with the watch inside Sebastian. Starlight, sensing the urgency, began to move towards the stables, keeping to the shadows of the trees. "Isabel!" Edward's shout was closer now. It was then that something extraordinary happened. Instead of heading into the stables, Starlight moved forward towards a part of the estate Isabel had never explored. The path grew narrower, flanked by ancient trees forming a natural tunnel. "There she is!" Edward's voice sounded distant, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Starlight quickened her pace, moving confidently along a path she seemed to know well. Isabel clung to the mare's mane, her heart beating in time with the hooves against the ground. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, they reached a small clearing. In its center, partially overgrown, stood a structure that made Isabel gasp. An old hunting lodge, its dark windows like eyes watching the night. Starlight stopped gently beside the building. Isabel slid off, her legs trembling slightly. The key inside Sebastian seemed to burn, demanding her attention. With hesitant steps, she approached the hunting lodge door. The lock was rusted, but the key, it fit perfectly. A soft creak echoed through the clearing as the door swung open. The interior was dark, but a faint glimmer of light came from somewhere deeper inside. Isabel took a step forward. Sebastian held tightly in her arms. That's when she heard it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of someone else breathing inside the lodge. Isabel froze in the doorway of the hunting lodge, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would escape her chest. The breathing she heard was soft, rhythmic, like someone sleeping. Outside, Starlight remained silently vigilant. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Is anybody there?" A sudden movement in the darkness, followed by the sound of chains shifting. Then a hoarse voice, almost forgotten from disuse, answered, "Isabel, my little Isabel." That voice, it was different now, weaker, but there was something in it that stirred deeply buried memories. Memories of bedtime stories, of oatmeal with cinnamon, of piano music. "Daddy Charles?" The words escaped like a sigh. A sob came from the darkness. "Thank God you found me. I knew you could. You were always so clever, my girl." Isabel advanced, cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. In a corner of the hunting lodge, illuminated only by the faint light filtering through a small window, sat a man. His hair was longer and messier, his beard untrimmed, but his eyes, they were the same kind eyes from the photographs, the eyes she had missed so much. "Daddy!" She ran towards him, but stopped abruptly when she saw the chains binding him to a wall. What happened to you?" Charles reached out his chained hands to touch his daughter's face. His fingers trembled. "Edward, my brother. He planned everything. The accident was staged. He kept me here while he took over my life, my family." Isabel held her father's hands, tears streaming down her face. I knew something was wrong. He didn't know our stories. He didn't make the oatmeal right. He didn't... Shh. Charles soothed her, squeezing her small hands. You were always so observant. How did you find this place? Starlight brought me, and Henry helped me find the watch, which had clues about the sundial, and a warning neigh from Starlight interrupted the explanation. Distant voices could be heard, approaching through the woods. Isabel! Edward's shout echoed through the trees. I know you're out here somewhere. Quick, whispered Charles. Look, on the shelf behind that tarp, there's a toolbox. Isabel ran to the indicated spot, finding an old metal box. Inside, among rusted screwdrivers and nails, was a small ring of keys. The third key, Charles instructed. It opens the chains. With trembling fingers, Isabel tried the key. It didn't work. Second try, nothing. The voices were closer. Now. Easy, daughter, Charles whispered. Take a deep breath. You can do it. Isabel closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath as her father suggested, and tried again. This time, the key turned smoothly, and the chains clicked open. Charles stood up with difficulty, his legs weak after so much confinement. Isabel put her arm around his waist, trying to help him balance. Let's go, she said. Starlight can take us. Isabel! Edward's voice sounded dangerously close now. Father and daughter moved as silently as possible to the door. Starlight waited exactly where Isabel had left her, like a white guardian angel in the night. You first, whispered Charles, helping Isabel mount. Then, with considerable effort, he managed to climb up behind her. Starlight began to move, choosing a different path than the one they had used to arrive. The voices and flashlights of their pursuers seemed to come from all directions, but the mare moved with precision between the trees, as if she knew every inch of the terrain. There! A shout came from their right. A flashlight beam cut through, the darkness nearly catching them. Isabel clutched Sebastian to her chest, feeling the watch and the letter still hidden inside. Her father held her tighter, shielding her as Starlight quickened her pace. Starlight galloped through the night like a white phantom, her hooves barely seeming to touch the ground. Isabel could feel her father's heart pounding against her back, his hands trembling but firm around her. The sound of engines and voices pursued them through the darkness. We need to get to the main house, Charles murmured. Your mother. She needs to know the truth. As if understanding the command, Starlight shifted her direction slightly, taking a path Isabel didn't recognize through the woods. The flashlights of their pursuers flickered between the trees like menacing fireflies. Suddenly, a figure appeared. Ahead of them on the trail, it was Henry. The groundskeeper stood beside his old pickup truck, waving urgently. This way, he called in a low voice. Edward blocked the main entrance to the manor. Starlight didn't hesitate, following Henry. As he guided the truck slowly along a secondary path, Isabel realized they were skirting the property via an old service road, almost completely overgrown. You didn't leave? Isabel whispered as they drew closer. And leave you alone, miss? Henry smiled, though his eyes remained alert. Just waiting for the right moment. And I see you found who you were looking for. Henry, Charles's voice was thick with emotion. You knew all along. Suspected, sir. The animals always knew, especially Starlight. She'd spend hours looking towards the hunting lodge. So I started investigating, left food nearby, but I needed concrete proof before I acted. A distant shout interrupted the conversation. They went that way. Surround the property! Quick! Said Henry. There's a side entrance near the greenhouse. Edward probably doesn't remember it. It was built after he left home 20 years ago. They followed in silence, Starlight moving like a shadow beside the truck. As they neared the manor, they saw lights on in almost every window. Several cars were parked at the main entrance, and men with flashlights patrolled the perimeter. Helen! Edward was in the front garden, his voice carrying false concern. Helen, you need to call the police. Isabel ran off with a stranger. Mommy needs to see you, Isabel said, squeezing her father's hand. She's been so sad. Let's head to the greenhouse, whispered Henry. There's a direct passage to the library from there. Mrs. Ashworth often goes there when she's upset. With extreme care, they dismounted Starlight. Charles's legs trembled from the exertion of the ride, and Isabel and Henry had to support him. The mare remained where she was, like a white sentinel in the night. The greenhouse was a maze of glass and plants, but Henry guided them safely through it. Through the glass panes, they could see the shadows of Edward's men passing by, searching in the wrong places. Finally, they reached an old door, partially hidden by a flowering vine. Henry opened it carefully, revealing a narrow passage leading directly into the house. The library is to the right, he whispered. I'll distract Edward and his men in the garden. Good luck. Isabel quickly hugged the groundskeeper before following her father down the passage. The girl's heart beat faster and faster as they approached the library. Through the slightly ajar door, they could see Helen sitting in her favorite armchair, a closed book in her lap, staring blankly into space. Mommy, Isabel called softly, entering the library. Helen turned, her eyes widening as she saw her, a daughter. Isabel, where have you... Her voice died as Charles stepped into the room. The book fell from her lap with a soft thud. Charles? Her voice was barely a whisper. No, it can't be. You died, Edward said. Edward lied, Charles said gently, his voice hoarse with emotion. About everything. Helen stood up, her legs shaky. She took one step forward, then another, until she was close enough to touch her husband's face. Her fingers trembled as she traced the familiar lines, now marked by time and suffering. It's you, she whispered. It's really you. The moment of reunion was shattered by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Helen quickly guided Charles and Isabel behind a massive bookshelf, just in time to see Edward enter the library. Helen, you can't just sit here. Our daughter is out there with some... He stopped abruptly, his eyes taking in the scene. The fallen book, Helen's transformed expression, the secret passage door still slightly ajar. She's not our daughter, Edward, Helen said, her voice carrying a strength Isabel had never heard before. And you are not who you claim to be. Edward closed the library door with a soft click. His face, usually controlled, began to show cracks in his mask of civility. Don't be ridiculous, Helen. Grief is affecting your mind. Grief? Helen laughed. A humorless sound. What grief, when there was no body, when you never let me see the accident site, when you burned every old photo of Charles you could find. I did that to protect you. Edward stepped forward, his voice taking on that manipulative tone Isabel knew so well. To help you move on. No! Helen held up a hand, cutting him off. You did it to protect yourself, to hide your lies. Isabel, hidden behind the bookshelf with her father, clutched Sebastian tightly. Inside the bear, the watch and the letter seemed to pulse with the truth they held. Lies. Edward laughed, but there was a tremor in his voice. What lies, Helen? I took care of you, gave you the life of a queen, raised that girl as if she were my own, as if she were yours. Helen advanced a step. You tried to send her away at the first opportunity. Why? Because she started asking the right questions. Because she saw through you like no one else could. Edward adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture that betrayed his growing unease. You're hysterical, Helen. I'm going to call a doctor. The only sick one here is you, Edward. Helen pulled something from her pocket. It was an old photograph, yellowed at the edges. I found this today, hidden in the back of a drawer you couldn't reach. Do you know what it shows? Edward visibly paled. It shows you and Charles, still children, in the garden of this house. You were left-handed, Edward, always were. Charles was right-handed. Helen pointed at the photo with a trembling hand. The man who buried our dog in the garden 2 months ago used his right hand. The man who signed all the company documents these past months used his right hand. But you drink coffee with your left hand? You cut your food with your left hand? Helen, where is my husband, Edward? The silence that followed was deafening. Isabel could feel her father trembling slightly beside her, his hands squeezing her shoulders protectively. "Your husband is dead," Edward said finally, his voice cold as ice, "and you'd be better off accepting that once and for all." "No," a new voice sounded in the library. "I'm not dead, brother." Charles stepped out from behind the bookshelf, keeping Isabel protected behind him. Edward stumbled back as if punched, his face losing all color. "Impossible," he whispered. "You were supposed to be locked up, buried, forgotten." Charles advanced slowly. "Just like you planned from the beginning, wasn't it? Ever since you found out Father had changed the will, leaving everything to me?" Helen brought her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "The accident, was it you, Edward, all this time?" "He forged everything," Charles said, his voice heavy with years of contained pain. "The accident, my death, even the company, documents. But he made one mistake. He forgot some things can't be copied. True love can't be forged, Edward. Our daughter knew that from day one." Isabel, still holding Sebastian, took a step forward. "The watch, Uncle Edward. Why did you try to bury it in the garden?" Edward fixed his gaze on Sebastian, recognizing the suspicious small bulge in the bear's belly. His face twisted into a mask of controlled fury. "That watch," he said, stepping towards Isabel, "is mine by right. Everything here is mine by right." "Don't come near her," Charles warned, placing himself between his brother and his daughter. At that moment, a familiar neigh sounded from outside. Starlight was in the garden, directly beneath the library window. The sound seemed to trigger something in Edward, a memory perhaps, or a deep-seated fear. "That mare," he muttered. "I always knew there was something wrong with her. The day I tried in the garden, she watched me, as if she knew." "She always knew," Isabel said, her voice small but firm. "Just like I always knew you weren't my daddy." Daddy Charles tells the Three Bears story, making different voices for each character. Daddy Charles plays Claire de Lune on the piano when I can't sleep. Daddy Charles... "Enough!" Edward slammed his fist on a nearby table, making everyone jump. "I tried to be patient, tried to be a father to you, but you're just like him. Always watching, always questioning, always seeing through your lies," Helen finished, moving closer to her daughter. "Like I should have from the beginning." A strange smile formed on Edward's face. "You know what's ironic? I really only planned to send the girl to boarding school. But now..." He reached into his suit jacket pocket. "Edward," Charles's voice was tense, "think carefully about what you're doing." "Think?" Edward laughed, a harsh, joyless sound. "I've thought about everything for 20 years, planned every detail, the perfect accident, the perfect documents, the perfect life, and it would have worked if it weren't for this meddling brat." Isabel hugged Sebastian tighter, feeling the watch inside. She suddenly remembered the letter she had found with the key, still unread. "The letter," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You knew about the letter in the sundial, didn't you? That's why you wanted Daddy's watch so badly." Edward froze. "What letter?" With trembling fingers, Isabel pulled the yellowed envelope from inside Sebastian. "This one, addressed to Mommy, in Daddy Charles's handwriting." Helen reached for the letter, but Edward was faster. With a swift movement, he snatched the envelope from Isabel's hands. "No!" cried Charles, moving forward. Edward tore open the envelope and began to read, his face growing paler and paler. "No! No! This can't be. What does the letter say, Edward?" Helen's voice was sharp. "He knew," Edward muttered, crumpling the paper in his trembling hands. Charles knew all along about the forged will. He had proof. Proof he left hidden. The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, rapidly approaching. "Henry," whispered Isabel, a smile forming on her face. "He must have called the police." Edward looked frantically around, like a cornered animal. His eyes landed on the watch, still partially visible in Sebastian's belly. "That watch is the last piece," he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "With it, I can prove this is all a misunderstanding, that you're all confused, distraught by loss." "No," said Isabel, taking a step back. "The watch belongs to Daddy Charles. It always has." The sirens were closer now. Blue and red lights began to dance on the library walls through the windows. Edward glanced quickly at the door, then the window, then the watch. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't lose. Not after all this time. Not after everything I've done." It was then that Starlight neighed again, louder this time. The sound startled Edward, causing him to take a misstep. His foot caught on the rug, and as he tried to regain his balance, the letter he held flew from his hand, fluttering like a dry leaf until it landed at Helen's feet. Helen picked up the letter with trembling hands and began to read aloud. "My dearest Helen, if you are reading this, something has gone wrong. Edward found out that Father changed the will, leaving the company to me on the condition that I transform it into something more ethical, more humane. My brother never understood that there are things more important than money. I found documents proving he has been falsifying reports for years, diverting funds to secret accounts. All the proof is stored in the safest place I know, inside the sundial I built for our Isabel the day she was born. If something happens to me, look for my father's watch. It is the key to everything. With eternal love, Charles." The sound of the sirens was deafening now. Hurried footsteps echoed through the halls of the manor. "It's over, Edward," Charles said softly. "You can try to do the right thing, just for once in your life." Edward looked at the window, then at the door, his face a mask of despair. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't have a choice. Dad always preferred you, always trusted you." "You had a choice," Helen interrupted, still holding the letter. "You always did. You could have been honest. You could have changed. You could have been like perfect Charles," Edward shouted, all his composure finally shattering. "The ideal son, the perfect husband, the loving father." Isabel, still sheltered between her parents, watched her uncle with a mixture of pity and understanding only a child can possess. "Uncle Edward," she said softly, "Daddy Charles isn't perfect. He sometimes burns the oatmeal, and when he tells the Three Bears story, he always forgets some parts and makes up others." Something in the simplicity of that observation seemed to hit Edward deeply. He staggered as if he'd taken a physical blow. "Police are coming up, sir," Henry's voice called from the hallway. At that moment, Starlight neighed one last time, a sound that seemed heavy with urgency. Edward turned to the window and saw the white mare in the garden, illuminated by the flashing police lights, her eyes fixed on him with ancient wisdom. "She tried to warn me," he muttered. "The day I moved in here, she never let me get close. Like she knew." "Animals always know," Isabel said. "That's what Henry taught me." The library door burst open. Police officers flooded the room, followed by Henry, who carried a thick folder. "All the proof is here," the groundskeeper said, handing the folder to the nearest officer. "The original documents from the safe, the bank transfers, everything I found in the sundial." Edward offered no resistance as the officers approached. He seemed to have aged decades in minutes, all his arrogance replaced by an expression of utter defeat. "I just wanted to prove I could be better than you," he said to Charles as the handcuffs were fastened. "I just wanted someone to look at me the way everyone always looked at you." Charles stepped forward, still supporting Isabel and Helen. You're my brother, Edward. Always were. You just had to ask for help. Isabel gently pulled away from her parents' embrace and approached her uncle. Carefully, she took the watch from inside Sebastian and held it out to Edward. "Grandpa gave this watch to Daddy Charles," she said, "but there's another one just like it in the attic. It was yours, wasn't it? From the day you both graduated." Edward looked at the watch, tears finally welling in his eyes. "How did you know?" "The old photos. You were wearing identical watches, but you kept yours in your left pocket, and Daddy Charles kept his in his right." A sob escaped Edward's throat as the police led him away. The last sound they heard was his choked voice. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything." Dawn found the Ashworth family gathered on the manor's porch, watching the sun rise over the garden where everything had begun. Helen was nestled in Charles's arms, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. Isabel, sitting on the swing her father had built years ago, hugged Sebastian while watching starlight graze peacefully under the first golden rays. Henry approached, carrying a tray with hot chocolate, prepared exactly as Charles used to, make it with a hint of cinnamon and marshmallows floating on top. "I thought we could all use a little comfort," he said, distributing the steaming mugs. "Henry," Charles turned to the groundskeeper, "I can never thank you enough for looking after my family, for investigating, for—" "You would have done the same for me, sir," Henry interrupted gently. "Besides, I had help." He glanced meaningfully at Starlight, who raised her head as if understanding she was being mentioned. Isabel hopped off the swing and ran to the mare, offering her an apple she had saved from breakfast. "You knew all along, didn't you? That's why you kept looking towards the hunting lodge, why you took me there." Starlight accepted the apple delicately, her intelligent eyes fixed on the girl with something that looked very much like affection. "Some say animals see beyond appearances," Henry commented. "They see the truth in people, even when we try to hide it." Helen stood up and walked over to her daughter, her eyes glistening. "Forgive me, sweetheart. I should have realized, should have listened when you said something was wrong." "It's okay, Mommy." Isabel hugged her mother. "You were sad, and Uncle Edward was very good at pretending." "Edward," Charles sighed, joining his family. "I spent so much time angry at him, but now I just feel pity." "He'll have time to think about what he did," Henry said. "And who knows, maybe one day he'll learn he didn't have to pretend to be someone else to be loved," Isabel finished, surprising everyone with her wisdom. Helen smiled through her tears. "When did you get so wise, my little one?" "I think she always was," Charles replied, running a hand through his daughter's hair. "We just needed to pay more attention." The sound of an engine announced the arrival of more visitors. An official-looking car parked at the manor's entrance, and a distinguished gentleman with white hair, wearing an impeccable suit, stepped out. "Grandpa!" Isabel ran to embrace the man, who scooped her up, his eyes moist. "My brave granddaughter," he said, hugging her tightly. "When the police called me and told me everything, I could hardly believe it. Charles, my son." He held out an arm, and Charles joined the embrace. "Dad," Charles whispered, "I'm so sorry that Edward—" "No," Mr. Ashworth interrupted. "It's not your fault. Maybe it's mine for not realizing how much your brother was suffering, how much help he needed." Isabel took her grandfather's hand. "Grandpa, I found something that was yours." She pulled the watch from her pocket and handed it to Mr. Ashworth. The older man held the watch reverently. "Ah, yes. I gave one of these to each of my sons when they graduated, to remind them that time is too precious to be wasted on bitterness and envy." "Edward kept his in his left pocket," Isabel said softly. "Yes," Mr. Ashworth smiled sadly. "He was always different from his brother, even though they were twins, and that should have been celebrated, not turned into a competition." Starlight approached the group, her majestic presence drawing everyone's attention. Mr. Ashworth observed her with admiration. "So this is the famous Starlight, the guardian of truth." Isabel stroked the mare's muzzle. "She's more than that, Grandpa. She's family." 3 months passed, transforming the dramatic winter into a gentle spring. Ashworth Manor had changed, not just in its atmosphere, which was lighter and more welcoming, but also in its very structure. Charles supervised the renovation of the garden, transforming the spot where Edward had dug the hole into a beautiful bed of daisies, Isabel's favorite flowers. The hunting lodge was completely renovated and turned into a riding school for underprivileged children, an idea Isabel had after realizing how animals could help heal wounded hearts. Henry, now officially the project director, dedicated his mornings to teaching young riders to develop the same special bond Isabel shared with Starlight. On that particular spring afternoon, Isabel sat on the garden swing, watching her father play the piano through the open living room window. The melody of Clair de Lune floated through the air, mixing with the chirping of birds and the occasional neigh from Starlight. Helen approached, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate with cinnamon. "Thought you might like some company," she said, sitting beside her daughter. "Mommy," Isabel took her mug. "Do you think Uncle Edward is okay?" Helen put her free arm around her daughter. "Your grandfather visits him every week. He says he seems different, calmer, more genuine. He asked to see me," Isabel revealed. "He wrote me a letter. And do you want to see him?" Isabel fell silent for a moment, watching Starlight, who, as always, grazed near the swing. "I think so. Not because I've forgotten what he did, but because you have a huge heart," Charles finished, having approached silently, "just like your mother." "In the letter," Isabel continued, "he said he's learning to play the piano, and that he understands now that he didn't need to be just like you, Daddy. He just needed to be himself." Charles sat on the other side of the swing. "You know, sometimes people get lost trying to be who they think they should be, instead of discovering who they really are." "How did you know who you were, Daddy?" Charles smiled, looking at Helen. "I had people who loved me for who I was, not for who I could be. And I had a very clever daughter who always saw the truth, even when it was hidden." Isabel leaned her head against her father's shoulder. "Like Starlight?" "Exactly like Starlight," he agreed. "Did you know your grandfather decided to donate a part of the company to create a horse sanctuary? Says he was inspired by a certain white mare who saved our family." Just then, Henry appeared in the garden, accompanied by a group of smiling children. It was time for the riding lesson. Starlight immediately approached, majestic as ever, but now with a new gentleness in her eyes as she saw the children. "Come on, Miss Isabel," Henry called. "How about helping with today's lesson? We have some new students who are still a little scared." Isabel looked at her parents, who nodded encouragingly. She jumped off the swing and ran towards the group, pausing only to give Starlight a quick hug. "You know," she said to the children, "when I was scared, I found the best thing to do was to trust. Trust the animals, who always know the truth. Trust in love, which always finds a way. And trust in time, which always brings the answers we're looking for." Helen and Charles watched their daughter with pride as she gently guided a shy little girl towards Starlight. The afternoon sun bathed the garden in golden light, making the mare's white coat shine like snow. In the manor's library, on the mantelpiece, above the fireplace, 2 old identical watches were displayed side by side, one belonging to Charles, the other to Edward. Their hands, finally repaired, moved in perfect synchrony, marking not just the hours, but also the beginning of a new time, a time of healing, truth, and love. And in the garden, under the gentle spring breeze, Starlight continued her silent vigil, no longer guarding dark secrets, but precious moments of joy and redemption. Her serene gaze seemed to say that some truths run so deep they can only be understood by the heart, and that love, when true, always finds its way back home.